I turn it over to my co-moderator, Laura Triplett.
Hello, everybody. So let me give you just a peek behind the curtain for a minute for the audience. We have been collecting your questions on pieces of paper, and we have been collecting your questions through our online service. We have a Gustavus professor and 2 Gustavus students sitting in the back, sifting through them, popping those, looking for themes, looking for common questions, and popping them up on my screen. So we will get to those. Thank you. First, though, I would like to ask the rest of our speakers and panel if they have questions for Dave or thoughts about the ways we have understood soil through history. What do you think, panel? Who wants it? Yeah, Frank, Dr. Uketer.
Maybe I can take a start here and well, pick you up on the way you started off in your presentation. You started with a view at history and really human history in all its breadth. And if you're a trained historian like myself, that first you get the, oh my goodness, this is a big argument. But there's that little voice in your head that, if you're a trained historian, tells you, well, do you really know? Or, as we historians like, do you have the documents to prove this? Now, we should be clear that agriculture in our archives, and even more when you move beyond the Western archives. And that's not very surprising, because if you look at world history, 80% of world history is agricultural history. So we have a treasure of documents, but it's always individual sites, individual stories, and quotes you cannot really check. So I would like to suggest, since my concern is always with how do we frame the narrative, you know, what is the theme that we suggest here? Maybe you could make an even more powerful narrative if you say, well, we have indications there were troubles, we have good reason to assume there were trouble in the soil, but we don't really know. And they didn't know either. And what this means is that you know there may be a clock ticking, there may be a clock ticking right now, but you do not know how far you're down that clock. And maybe that gives you a bit of a productive uncertainty about your view of the soils and where we stand in this epic quest.
There's a lot of historical documents that back up the things I was arguing. There's Roman tax records that demonstrate high wheat yields in Syria and Libya, where you can't grow wheat today, for example. So one of the things when you look at the archaeological record is the data you can collect today is very thin, right? So you can go back to historical sources, but they are there. Oh, yeah. And they do basically back up the general argument. And you can look today. We saw soil cores in a class yesterday from the soil around here. It looks like about 50% of the A horizon, the topsoil, is already gone. You look at, so you can compare, if you can also look at the soil itself and collect especially considered locations, say native prairie versus stuff that's been farmed for 100 years, and do a direct comparison in terms of what's actually changed. And like Iowa, for example, I think lost about half its topsoil. Eastern Washington, about the same deal, 50% has been moved, is no longer where it once was. But when you go back, one of the most fascinating things for me, and I'm not a historian, so I have a very different lens on it, but one of the fascinating things for me in researching dirt was reading the 4 books of Roman agriculture. Mm-hmm. And there's changes in the style of farming that's documented through time that relates not just to the state of the soil, but to the state of relations with their neighbors. State of other kinds of things. So I think when you look at the idea that soil erosion drove human history, if you just look at it that narrowly, you're missing an awful lot of the story. You need to look at, you can think about it, the way I think about it is that it's setting the stage for things like droughts. It's setting the stage for things like relationships with neighbors, what happened in the sort of political realm, and it's complicated, I would agree completely with. But there are historical documents you can look at that kind of back up elements of the story, and there's a lot more data today from a lot of styles of farming, from low technology to really high technology stuff that you can look at. And the weakest link in the argument that I'm making, I think, is to basically argue that the same clock would apply everywhere around the world, because it wouldn't. Because soils are different, they're different thicknesses, there's different erosion rates, different styles of farming cause erosion at different rates, and that clock can expand or contract with the way people manage their farms. And so one of the lessons I came away with in writing that book was that there's no real environmental determinism to the what actually plays out in the land. It's the coupled social environmental interaction that ends up driving it. And that's where there's a lot of room for a lot of different perspectives and eyes on the ball.
So can I just riff on that a little bit? So you're setting an idea, right? I mean, I'm fully on board with the science, the logic of the argument. It makes perfect sense. But you're still selling an idea. And one would assume that when people first started, after the Haber-Bosch process, to add synthetic nitrogen fertilizers into the soil in an epic level to increase Germany's food productivity, that they were selling an idea as well. And that it worked. Mm-hmm. Like you've been using, no-till, crop rotation, agriculture in certain processes, and there's productivity. But if you add this nitrogen fertilizer, and you're going to get increased productivity.
Not quite. No. One of the reasons that chemical fertilizers really took off in the Western world is the soil was already degraded because they were not no-till. So basically, the thing that so impressed me with visiting farmers around the world was how they could actually take those old ideas of crop rotation and cover crops and things, and actually figure out how to operationalize it with modern technology. Because if you look at you look at journals from colonial agriculture in the U.S., for example, people were complaining about how the land was no longer as fertile as it was in their grandfather's day. And a few centuries of tillage-based agriculture burns up a lot of organic matter. And so how do you rebuild that? People were very concerned about that, but they didn't connect it with the plow.
But of course they didn't have time to rebuild it because they had a war to fight and they needed to significantly increase the amount of food for the population in a very short space of time?
No. I mean, that's the special case of Germany in the Second World War. They had already degraded, when you degrade the organic matter, you can get a big boost of productivity, of yield, by adding nitrogen. Right. But if you add a lot of nitrogen to an already fertile soil, if you went out to a native prairie soil here and added nitrogen to it, you're not getting any more production.
Yeah. And to add to David's point, I'm a person that I'm not a scientist. I'm caught in the middle between the farmer and the scientist. I'm a conservation agronomist, so on thousands of acres, many, many farms. And the literature's been very clear that chemical fertilizer, only 60%, only 40% ever reaches the plant. A majority goes into the microbial herd. I call it the mafia. They'll take it up first. But a lot of it's lost. And so the literature's been around for quite a while showing that, like what David's showing. And once you see a very healthy soil, one of the things we do a test on is when we put chemical nitrogen on a very healthy soil, it doesn't respond. It's already doing its cycling internally. In fact, the yield goes down. I don't think people realize that chemical fertilizer is a salt. And now some literature shows that they have heavy metals and it actually impacts the organic matter. And another point for David is that as you throw copious amounts of manures and fertilizers, you set imbalance in the system. Now you've got too much nitrogen, and guess what the soil microbes are going to do? They're going to consume the house, eat the aggregates to reach a balance. They're going to consume that labile carbon. And so then now you affect aggregation. Now you affect water infiltration. So it's like this vicious cycle, just like tillage. You get in this vicious cycle, then you get into this addiction, and it's hard to break. So it's very difficult. You have to understand how that whole system works together, and you also know how to apply it logistically to the producer.
Yeah. Other panelists have yeah, Dr. Lal.
Dave, that was an excellent presentation. Very nice. Very well explained. Very good example. You made us a very good start. I especially like the concept that soil is like a bank account. You know, what you take out and what you put in have to somehow be in favor of what you put in. So that's very correct. I think the question really is how to translate this wisdom into action at a global scale. And I'm especially concerned with countries where the Green Revolution bypassed, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Andean region, the Caribbeans, and many other parts. Perhaps 500 to 600 million small landholders, 2 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres. 10 acres is a big farm. And 60 to 70% of them are women farmers. Expecting them to put that residue, which you are able to get from the neighbor shop, coffee shop, and neighbor's farm, and neighbor's leaves, and so forth, where would they get that from? And more importantly, please remember, and that bothers me, I know, I grew up on a small farm in Punjab. The price of wheat straw, which I would like them to put it back on the land to do exactly what you and I want them to do, is 70% of that of grains as a fodder. You tell them put it back on the land, they think you're gone crazy. I'm sincere about that point, and yet the organic matter content of those soil is 0.01%. Should be 2%. That's the dilemma. You want the resource-poor farmers to invest back on the land when they do not have anything to feed to the cattle, do not have anything to cook food with, do not have any resources to buy external inputs. How do you create a positive nutrient and carbon budget in an economy, in an African context, which on a continental scale has a nutrient deficit of 40 to 60 kilograms per hectare per year? That's the dilemma.
I think one of the things that you brought up that I think is so important and is the role of plants, and not just any old plant, but knowing your local plant community and working and cultivating that plant community. And there's like millions of years of indigenous knowledge on plant communities that are help build soil. And I think we can empower people to go back to those roots, to get the plants to do the building of the organic matter. You know, yes, we can add char and organic material and straw, and all that is good. But we have this beautiful machinery that's highly evolved called plants that do this themselves. And I think that, and it's not just any old plant, right? It's like, use the knowledge we've been building for thousands and thousands of years of how do you mix plants together? What species go with what species in order to build soil? And this isn't something that's done at an industrial level. I mean, I should say it can be done, but it's built on local knowledge. And women working on small-scale agricultural plots around the world, you know, they have that knowledge in them, or they can get that knowledge. And so it really is just at our fingertips if we can empower and give people the opportunity to use that long indigenous knowledge, and then we can build soil from there. I think to me that is the answer, is at the very local scale, is to re-empower people at that local scale, use their indigenous or their old knowledge to do that, help the plants to do that.
Dr. Shanu.
Yeah, now, David, well, I thank you for your talk and this vision, and I agree with the diagnostic. I kind of agree with the way forward you propose, but now that you have toured, it goes in line with the comment by Ratan Lal, now that you've toured and visited many farmers, what are the barriers to overcome to spread the way? What is the part of awareness, and what is something else?
Yeah, well,
other barriers.
a big barrier in certain parts of the world is exactly what Ratan was talking about, and sort of the repurposing of organic matter for like cooking fuel, for example,
Yes.
and other things. And you know, getting clever about how to get around that is an important thing. Figuring out the other thing, you know, in our yard, we imported a lot of organic matter. You can't do that for the whole world. Where are we going to go? You know, another planet to get it from? No, that won't work. You have to grow it on site. And so the idea of getting cropping systems that actually produce excess biomass that's non-consumable that can be repurposed towards building organic matter would be how I would suggest to answer that. So it's reconceiving essentially what you're growing along the lines of what works locally. That was a major theme that I found everywhere I went, is that the methods and techniques you used in one economy, climate, and cropping system aren't translatable. The principles seem to be, but the methods aren't. And and I would add to that sort of social and economic systems as well, because we have to figure out how to adapt that. And so what I'm basically arguing for is a different guiding philosophy of agriculture, not necessarily different specific methods, and how that could be adapted. And there's ways to think about that. I visited people in Central America who had been working on cooking stoves that would not fully combust organic matter, but turn it into charcoal, into biochar, which they would then put back into their fields. So they would get a use out of their organic matter, but they would also get a boost in fertility.
Okay. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. I'm going to start with a couple of sciencey questions. So maybe these are for Dave or maybe some of our other experts up here. What is organic matter in soil exactly?
What was it?
What is organic matter in soil?
Maybe I'll answer.
Yeah, Dr. Schindler.
It's everything that is alive or has been alive. So that is what is decomposing in the soil. So it's a variety of molecules, but basically has been alive or is alive.
Okay. And did you have something to add to that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't like the name organic matter because it's so weak. Organic matter, in my mind, is the secretions, excretions of life and death. Something had to live, something had to die, and that process left incredible supermolecules that we haven't even been able to identify yet. They're so complex, so elegant. So it's way more than just this fluffy material on the top. And I think coming back real quick to what the professor said here about going into India, is that it is a common problem all over the world, is leaving carbon. Our soils throughout the globe are carbon deficient. I don't care whether you're American or I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Central America, that was the same issue. The big issue was most people, even our producers, think the soil is just a growing medium. Once I shift the concept, it's alive. Just like your pet and your animal, just like any of those, then all of a sudden everything changes.
Yeah.
So it changes. So it's really critical to get people to understand it's alive.
Great. And for our audience, I think all of us up here sometimes use organic matter and carbon interchangeably because we talk about organic matter containing a lot of carbon. So we'll get to more of that this afternoon with the talks too. Another sciencey question, if soil erodes off of a field, then where does it all go?
That's a great question. There was a wonderful paper in, I think it was the journal Science, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, so that tried to address that very question. And what they documented for the whole Mississippi River Basin was that soil erosion rates had increased by a factor of about 10, but what was coming out the mouth of the Mississippi had declined by about half. So you're not creating or disappearing mass, right? It's going somewhere. And the short answer is that it's going to a number of places. The lower part of a field, into a river floodplain. It's getting trapped behind dams. Some of the best agricultural land we're going to have in the world 200-300 years from now are going to be behind abandoned dams.
Yeah.
Dave is right. The inorganic part of the soil goes into the floodplain, the rivers or deltas. And there's an organic part, which the previous question was asked, what's organic matter. That is very important, what is its fate in relation to erosion. And the carbon which is eroded by erosion, quite a lot of it goes back into the atmosphere, either as CO2 or methane. And that's a very important question these days in terms of research. For example, I estimate that 1 gigaton of carbon moved by erosion goes into the atmosphere as CO2. But there are other people who think that whatever goes into the ocean and the depressional side goes out of circulation forever. So there are two different viewpoints on that. The question is where and how much it goes and by what processes.
The major problem, so okay, two things there. The first one is there's some really good ongoing programs to restate floodplains around the United States. There's one over in Holland, Michigan, where the local community have got together and they've actually funded large-scale programs to put floodplains back into existence. But remember, floodplains aren't the same as wetlands. Wetlands are areas that are continuously flooded and therefore are actively anaerobic. They don't have any oxygen driving the mechanical processes in the soil. So you actually end up with a sporadic drying out and wetting, and drying out and wetting. And that's incredibly important for the biochemical processes in the soil. And so they've got a major problem. That river coming out of Holland, Michigan, into Lake Michigan, there's a massive dump of soil, topsoil material into the lake, which has caused huge ecological problems for the lake system, killing the organic life in the sediments in that lake environment, and therefore completely changing the ecological properties, stopping that environment from fixing carbon itself into the ecosystem. And so if you look at the bays just outside of southern California, so the San Diego and Los Angeles Valley basins, the areas out there, the sediment has been killed by years of topsoil deposition into that environment, which has significantly altered the carbon account, the carbon economy in the sediments of those subtidal regions of the ocean. And so when we focus on soils, we also need to focus on the other type of soil, which is sediment. And sediment, if continuously flooded environment, is still incredibly important for the carbon economy of our planet.
I tell producers the first act of erosion is downward. I tell people we don't have a runoff problem, we have an infiltration problem. See, what happens is when you you till the soil, you wake up these bacteria called R. strategis, and they consume these superbiotic glues that hold the sands and silts and clays. Once they get consumed, you get a rain, so the first thing that gets plugged up is the pores by the silts and the clays. Then you have an infiltration problem and the water runs off. We need to understand what caused the problem. Keep in mind, we have a raindrop coming at 15 to 20 miles an hour. So no biotic glues to hold and have the pore space and hold the clays and sands in a giant pore aggregate. Erosion happens first downward, then you have it at the end of the field.
We'll have some great demonstrations of that this afternoon out front and in the soil experience. I'm going to go to another question we have, a lot of questions from gardeners who are asking about, they're asking, what did you grow in your garden? But also, I think more generally, how could we improve the nutrient availability in gardens? And isn't aeration good in your garden? I thought that cultivating the soil would help get moisture to the roots, etc. So maybe that's a Dave or Suzanne question.
Basically, and I should clarify what Anne did in our garden,
Yep.
was layering organic matter on the surface. We didn't dig, we didn't aerate, we basically fed the soil. Is how we came to think about it. Because we would put out mulch and compost in the fall and be gone by the spring. And her attitude was, well, if the soil's hungry, we'll keep feeding it. Mm-hmm. And so the strategy was lots of different styles of organic matter and keeping everything covered. And it basically gradually built up the quality of the soil. We haven't used any fertilizers. We haven't used any digging. We were growing vegetables, a lot of salad greens now. It's sort of a...
Can you say something else?
Yeah, for sure. So I said in my last little thing about plants, right? Plants are sort of the drivers of the soil food web, which are all the organisms that cycle. Mm-hmm. They're trying to get energy from breaking down organic matter, and through doing that, they release nutrients. And they all have a little niche in the soil. So the plants themselves have niches, and the soil organisms that they support have niches. And so different plant species can do different things. They can access, for example, some nutrients in soils that are hard to get, or they might fuel, in particular, a certain part of the soil food web, or they might fix nitrogen. And so this gets back to how do you grow plants together to build organic matter, but also to access nutrients, which is what the soil or food web is very good at cycling. So again, it gets back to how do you combine these plants together so that they can create and fuel the production of organic matter? And we have a lot of knowledge on how to do this. And I think we can look back and see what works and what doesn't. So, for example, there's the famous story of the three sisters that the Potawatomi people use, which was including squash, corn, and beans. They all did something a little bit differently. The beans can fix nitrogen, the squash can provide a cover crop, and the corn can access phosphorus through its mycorrhizas. These plants can also all be hooked together by mycorrhizal networks because they all share the same ones in common. And so I think, it's really important to always remember that the plants and the microbes that they support, they pack niches, or they are able to access niches in the soil that can access and help build organic matters in very efficient ways. It's the diversity begets more diversity, which begets more organic material and more nutrient cycling.
Can you give us a brief definition of mycorrhizal network?
Sure.
Since that's the first time that popped up here.
Yeah, so one of the crucial part of the soil food web is mycorrhizas. So this is a type of fungus in the soil that is a symbiotic association that's usually a mutualistic association between the plants and the fungus. They join in this symbiosis, and the plant provides carbon or photosynthate or energy in exchange for nutrients and water that the fungus grows through the soil and picks up from the soil in all myriad of niches. So it's a symbiosis, which is quite different than the other fungi in the soil. Some are saprophytes, some are pathogens, some can even be endophytes, but this is a special group that is a symbiosis that's usually mutualistic.
Great, right.
Yeah, I was wondering about, I'm very impressed with what you did in the garden here, but I was also wondering, is this a good paradigm for agriculture? Historically, these are really two different strands. Gardens get way more care per square foot, and they are much more diverse, as you pointed out. And I would not be surprised if many people in the audience say, well, yes, you did a good job in your garden, but I have a farm of 500 acres, 1,000 acres. Does this matter for me?
Yeah, you're not going to be like going down to Starbucks and loading up on coffee grounds to cover 5,000 acres, right? There's an obvious difference. One of and I'll sort of deal with two elements of that. One is that when we started restoring the garden, it was a net sink of organic matter. We had to go find it, we had to import it, and we were using things like coffee grown in the tropics to re-fertilize a yard in the temperate zone, in a zone that historically, or I should maybe say prehistorically, had some of the highest organic matter contents in the soils in the world, and even more if you count the trees that used to grow there, because they were immense. And that's sort of an odd thing to do. That's not something you could do at a planetary scale. However, now, about 12, 15 years later, our yard is a net exporter of organic matter. We now produce more than it takes to actually compost and mulch the yard and keep the system going. So you could conceivably spread that in the urban environment. But one of the really big differences when you compare what we did in our yard to what farmers were doing that I visited is that they need to essentially grow the organic matter on site and repurpose it, because you're not going to be able to import organic matter at that scale to do it. So it's another example of how the general principles translate, build the organic matter back up, and how would you do that by cultivating the beneficial microbial life. But the mechanics of how you do it, if you tried to do what we did in our yard to a large farm, you're going to run out of organic matter quick smart.
Great.
You've got to grow it on site.
Oh, sorry. You've addressed this a little bit, but I have some questions about what will it take to make this shift? What are the obstacles for farmers to shifting to no-till agriculture? And starting to even think more policy-wide, local and policy-wide, I think. So if you, Dr. Long.
Well, no-till farming is a component of conservation agriculture as a system-based approach. So conservation agriculture, no-till, do not plow, leave the crop residue on the ground, on the surface, not turned under, grow a complex rotation, rather than corn, soybean, hay, meadow, any other diversity component, and grow a cover crop in the off-season. following integrated soil fertility management. Those 4 components put together make conservation agriculture. There is a lot of controversy. You read in the literature, this works, it doesn't work, it adds carbon, it doesn't add carbon, it fixes water, it doesn't conserve water. It's because people either follow one component, 2 components, but not the entire things together. And the different components for each site, biophysical and socioeconomic factors, govern what would it take to make it work. I fully agree with what Dave said. It was an excellent presentation from that perspective. The question is not whether it works or does not work. The question is we cannot afford not to make it work. And that's an issue where policy intervention is required. And because I was mentioning the input of returning the crop residue or following a complex rotation, in many cases it does have lower crop yield. And in that case, somebody on behalf of the global community has to compensate farmer for the ecosystem services that they create. That's not a subsidy. That's a payment for the service on mitigating climate change, reducing hypoxia, reducing algal bloom, conserving water, increasing biodiversity. That's a price we are asking farming community of the world to serve the globe. We must compensate them.
Okay.
That's the action I was asking Dave to talk about.
Yeah.
I think the biggest problem is the way we think, the way we see. The biggest thing when I promote conservation, I realize the biggest issue, I start with myself. Go look in the mirror. I am the problem. It's the way I look at the system. If you look at the way we were educated, a majority of producers think ourselves a growing medium. It's not alive. Another issue is it's our human nature, is that we want to take more than we give, and farming is nurturing. Now, back to the point of what we were talking about, can we do it without the carbon? How can we change large landscapes with very few inputs? I'm going to show some slides tomorrow. I just got back from Chihuahua, Mexico. The prairie, the deserts are becoming prairies just with livestock, changing huge tracts of land in the Chihuahuan desert with 6 inches of rain, and they're doing amazing things in a very hot, brittle environment with just cows. See, the thing that a lot of things that we forgot on this talk, you forgot another principle, 2 more principles. Livestock. Nature doesn't farm without animals, period. They're in our prairies and in our forests. You can't separate that component. And we've done that in agriculture, and it was a huge mistake. And it really have caused major desertification by taking animals out of the system, okay? The other one is we teach limit chemical and physical disturbance. Remember the picture that Dave was showing? It was an organic farm. That farm, I've been on that farm, uses huge amounts of cover crops. But the tillage was so brutal, it offset the diversity. We need to understand that our chemicals, our tools are disrupting the system too. So it's not just about putting carbon, it's about handling the tools. So it comes to this one point.
Okay.
Understanding is my goal. I don't promote no-till. I do not promote cover crops. I don't promote the tools. I promote the changing of the heart and mind, understanding. Then they know how to use the tools. Tomorrow you'll see where ranchers use cattle as a tool. So what changed them? Desperation, and they changed the way they see things. They changed to more of a holistic thinking, not reductionist science, which all of us have been a part of. So we're changing the way we look at things.
Is there anything in the Farm Bill that would give incentives to transition to some of these things? So we're talking about the U.S. Farm Bill right now.
I used to promote the Farm Bill.
Okay.
As a USDA employee, I carried out the Farm Bill. and it has problems, major problems. One of the problems I have such an issue with is crop insurance, for example. Crop insurance has hurt us, but it was a wonderful concept and an idea because people don't understand that farmers and ranchers take incredible risk. They maintain billions of dollars of infrastructure, millions in their home. So here's what the thing. So crop insurance is allowed in eastern Colorado for producers to plant corn where they shouldn't be planting corn because ecologically it's too dry. But see, crop insurance allows them to do that because they'll get their money back. It's like saying, you know what, if you're a bad driver, you drink, create a lot of accidents, you still pay the same car insurance. So our policy needs to change, and we need to reward farmers who are doing a good job, give them a lower premium.
Okay. Yeah.
The answer to your question is no. And the reason I'm saying no is if we were to encourage farmers here in the US to adopt what we're talking about, then there should be a fair societal value of carbon paid to the farmer. And there's a difference between societal value and economic value. Economic value in Chicago Climate Exchange depends on the demand and supply. Who wants to buy carbon from farmers? Not many people, because we haven't solved the quota. So the societal value is what does the carbon in soil does to the society, for the nature. Those two are very different prices. The cost on Chicago Climate Exchange is less than $1 a ton of CO2. You can't buy a cup of coffee with that. The price societal value of carbon, what it does to climate change mitigation, for algal bloom, for water security, water quality, food security, nutritional security, is perhaps more than $120 per ton. If it's $120 per ton, the average carbon sequestration in the Midwest United States is about 1/3 of a ton per hectare. That's $40 per hectare. That's $16 per acre. If you want farmers to expect to do that thing, that's what is to be paid. And that's not a subsidy. No, it's not a handout. No, it's not a charity. It's a payment for the service that we are asking farmers community to do. That must be in the Farm Bill. It's not.
Frank, did you?
Just want to point out briefly.
Or just one quick thing I think we need to mention. NRC has been for... Oh, sorry.
I just want to point out to you briefly that the idea of paying subsidies or monetary benefits to people who conserve the soil, some of those ideas that really need to think through carefully because it's a great idea, but this country has been doing it since 1936. So whatever we expect from monetary benefits, we should be clear, this cannot be the only thing and probably just being an incentive towards something that is much grander like raising awareness.
Could you say more about that? How has this country been doing that? Or
you mean a
talking about this
presentation on 83 years of subsidies? No, I mean...
the conservation resource program and things like that.
Research programs, land retirement programs, soil conservation benefits, soil conserving crops. I mean...
Yeah, okay.
What is your take on this?
Well, just real quick, 83 years, our agency, Soil Erosion Service, Soil Conservation Service, NRCS, for 83 years we've been working on conservation. And yet sediment is still the #1 water quality issue in the nation. 83 years. We have spent billions, maybe close to $1 trillion. Why haven't we fixed the problem yet? Did programs fix it? No. The issue is that we need to invest in people and we need to train. We need to change the paradigm. The beginning of the question that we all had was the first question. Has the way we look at the soil impacted agriculture? It has hugely. Case in point, I was taught soil is a medium and chemistry and physics and genetics is my tools. That's why I walked away from college. As I teach all over the country, that's what's taught in most agronomy and soil science schools. It's changing until that paradigm shifts and changes on a global scale that we teach the community, we teach the church, we teach the kids, we teach everybody. Even the high school, the grade school curriculum still teaches the soil's not alive. So it's a major education issue in my mind.
Okay, Dave, I'm going to come back to you for a little soil ABCs questions to make sure we all have some vocab heading into the rest of the day. What are cover crops, and how do you plant without plowing?
Okay, well, I'll do that, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Ray. But cover crops are crops that you plant to keep the ground covered, and they're not your cash crops. So you're basically not harvesting them to sell them. You're growing them, in effect, to fertilize, to protect the ground surface from erosion and to fertilize your crop. Because if you plant a cover crop and you let it go to seed, what you've done is you've planted weeds. If you plant a cover crop and you terminate it, you kill it before it goes to seed, it will rot. The elements it has extracted from the soil will then get returned to the soil, but they'll be in more plant-available forms than they were before that cover crop pulled it out of the mineral particles, or the fungi pulled them out of the mineral particles and traded it to the plant for exudates and got them into the biological world. The way a geologist looks at soils and sort of the chemistry of it in the big picture is kind of as a refining process. You look at the bulk chemistry of a human being and the bulk chemistry of a rock, they're really different. But we turn rocks into people with the help of plants. Because the plants need elements out of the rocks too. They get the carbon, the nitrogen, the hydrogen, the oxygen out of photosynthesis and water. But everything else that makes up a plant ultimately came out of a rock. Have you ever tried to eat a rock? Probably we all did as kids, right? But it didn't work very well.
Break for lunch, aren't we?
You can think of a lot of the sort of the minor elements that are in rocks have a much bigger role to play in biology. Zinc is pretty rare in geology. It's vitally important for enzyme function in living systems. And so you can think of cycles of life and death where your plants are pulling elements out of the soil, and they're high grading. They're getting the good stuff. They're not pulling the iron and the aluminum out. Well, the iron to some degree, but the aluminum and the oxygen, no. And through cycles of life and death and organic turnover, you can build up, you can high grade, you can refine what's actually in the soil so that it's more beneficial to life. And if you think of plants that way, then the cover crops you can kind of think of as an agency, a vehicle for doing that. Yeah. And that's where also, you know, the crop stubble, the part we're not eating of the crops we grow, you return it back to the land, let it rot, you're basically doing one more crank in that grand wheel of life. That stuff becomes available then for another generation of plants that might get refined in a way that could feed somebody off the farm. And I don't know if I answered the question, but
I love it. And there was one other question. How do you plant without plowing? Do you want
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
First of all, to add to what Dave said about a cover crop, it's a crop grown in an off-season without harvesting any economic benefits, primarily to keep the ground covered. That's why it's a cover crop. How do you plant through it is with a no-till is a very important question, because that's hard to. You essentially divide the land into three components. A seedling zone, where a small slot is cut by a disc, narrow disc, and a seed is dropped into that small slot and covered with a press wheel to create seed-soil contact. In between the two rows is a soil and water conservation zone. That zone is always kept covered by crop residue. So water infiltrates into the ground and it does not evaporate. And mulch also controls weeds. There's a third zone, traffic zone. The wheel of the tractor must always go at the same place year after year after year. Otherwise, the whole ground will be compacted. We don't want to do that. So it is what we call precision tillage, zonal tillage. It's a very important scientific discovery.
I have to be the heavy and say it is 11:30. I am governed by the atomic clock. So I want to thank our panelists for a great opening conversation. Which was fueled by wonderful questions from the audience. And thanks especially to Laura for picking out some of those questions about the vocabulary that we will be using for the rest of the time. A couple of announcements. Since you were last here, Gustavus has become a smoke-free campus. Please know that there is nowhere on campus where you are allowed to smoke. So,
Oh, that's nice.
so you need to leave. If you would like to smoke, please exit the campus borders. And then the second thing is, don't forget that you still have unanswered questions, and you can get them answered by going into the forum and joining a lunch table discussion. And if you can't get them answered, you can get them more clearly articulated, put them back into the ground, and sequester some carbon. So thank you.
The snow covered the campus. Not a surprise. Everything looked pristine, almost posed. But you could feel something human in the air, something stronger than the winter wind, something you could almost touch. It was the heartbeat of a small college nestled in the middle of the Great Plains, where the students, faculty, and administration are at one with each other, in academics and surely in values.